The email arrived on a Wednesday, and that detail mattered more than my wife probably realized when she chose the day. Wednesdays had been our standing dinner night for 28 years, not because we planned it that way at the start, but because it settled into the week the way habits do when two people stop choosing them and simply keep them. I had never thought much about it until I was standing at the kitchen counter at 7:18 in the morning, waiting for the coffee to finish, and I opened my phone to find an email from a law firm in Richmond I had never heard of. It was brief and formal. My wife had retained counsel. She was requesting that I vacate the property at our shared address within 45 days, citing the recent settlement of her father's estate as providing the financial basis for her to proceed independently. If I had questions, I was invited to contact the firm's offices during business hours. I read it once, then I read it again. Then I put the phone face down on the counter and watched the coffee finish brewing. Her father had died 6 weeks earlier, quietly, at his home in Richmond. He had been a CPA for 34 years before retiring, the kind of man who kept a yellow legal pad on his desk to write down questions before he made phone calls. I had liked him from the beginning. He had a way of listening that was unusual, the kind that made you feel your words were being sorted rather than just collected. I had assumed he felt the same about me. I was about to find out how much he had. I poured the coffee. I drank it at the counter, not the table. I looked out at the yard the way I did every morning, the 2 acres we had broken ground on in 1997, the brick colonial we had spent 11 months building before we moved in. I had poured the footings myself on a February weekend when the ground was just soft enough. My wife had brought sandwiches both days and told me the east wall wasn't plumb. She had been right. I finished the coffee. I rinsed the mug. I went to the filing cabinet in the office off the hallway, the one she had suggested we donate to Goodwill twice. In the second drawer, behind the warranty folders and the homeowner's insurance binders, I found what I was looking for: the deed from 1997, the title transfer from 2003 after the refinance, the satisfaction of mortgage from 2019. Every page had both our names on it. I photographed each one and sent them to a number I had not used in 3 years. My old colleague from the Corps of Engineers days had gone to law school in his 40s and was now a property attorney in Harrisonburg. I had attended his daughter's graduation and sent a bottle of good bourbon when he passed the bar. I typed one line beneath the photographs: "I may need some guidance this week. No rush, but soon." His reply came back in 20 minutes. "Call me at noon. Office line." I wrote the time on a sticky note and pressed it to the cabinet. Then I went upstairs, made the bed the way I always made it, and came back down to start the day, because there was no use beginning a long stretch of hours with small disorder. My wife called at 8:47. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 8:52, and again at 9:04. I answered the third call because I wanted the gap between them to tell her something without words. Her voice was prepared. She had clearly thought through what she wanted to say, or someone had helped her think it through. She told me the estate settlement had given her a clarity she hadn't expected, that she felt the time had come for both of us to have space to figure out what we wanted, that she hoped I would make this easy on everyone. She used the phrase "a clean break" 4 times in 4 minutes. People repeat the words they've rehearsed. I let her finish. Then I asked, in the same voice I used to review load calculations with younger engineers, whether she had reviewed the property documents before instructing her attorney to send that email. A pause, not long but real. She told me the property details weren't the point. The point was that she was ready to move forward, and she hoped I was too. I told her the property details were the whole point, actually, and that I would need a few days to review my options. She told me I was making this harder than it needed to be. I told her I was making it exactly as careful as it needed to be. She said she would have her attorney follow up. I said that was fine. We hung up at 9:13. I noted the time. At noon, I called my attorney. He picked up on the first ring and listened without interrupting while I laid out the situation. When I finished, he asked me 3 questions: whether the deed had ever been amended, whether we had signed any postnuptial agreements, whether the estate her father left her included any claim or lien on the property. The answer to all 3 was no. He said, "She cannot remove you from a jointly titled property without your consent or a court order. If her attorney told her otherwise, he either doesn't know property law in Virginia, or he's telling her what she wants to hear to keep the billing hours running." I asked him what we should do first. He said, "Send a letter. No emotion, no threat. Just a statement of fact. Your name is on the deed. You have not agreed to vacate. Any attempt to change locks, remove your property, or otherwise interfere with your occupancy will be documented and addressed accordingly. We copy her attorney on everything from this point forward." He drafted the letter while I held the line. It took him 9 minutes. He read it back to me. It was precise and level, the kind of language that doesn't need a raised voice because the facts are doing the work. I told him it was good. We sent it to the Richmond firm by email and certified mail before 2 o'clock. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the garage. I had been restoring a roll-top desk I found at an estate sale in Waynesboro the previous fall. Good quarter-sawn oak with a timbre that had warped slightly from humidity. I worked on the timbre guides for 2 hours, the kind of quiet, patient work that keeps your hands busy while your mind sorts things out. My wife sent 2 messages while I was out there. The first said her attorney had confirmed her position. The second said she had already been in contact with a moving coordinator. I photographed both messages and forwarded them to my attorney with one sentence. She is planning a move on my behalf. I have not agreed. His reply came back quickly. Good. Stay on the property. Don't engage emotionally. I'll have a response ready tomorrow. I went back to the desk. That evening, my daughter called from Asheville. She had already heard from her mother. I could tell from the silence at the start of the call that she had been sitting with the news for a while before dialing. I didn't defend myself and didn't criticize her mother. I told my daughter I was handling it carefully and that I would keep her informed when there was something specific to say. She was quiet for a moment and then asked if I was okay. I told her I was. She said she didn't like any of this. I told her neither did I. We talked for a while about her garden, which had been giving her trouble with the clay soil, and about a trail she and her husband had found near the Blue Ridge Parkway. Before she hung up, she said, "She doesn't get to just rewrite 28 years. I told her she was right, and that I was making sure of it through the proper channels. I slept adequately. Not well, adequately. That was enough for what the morning required. My attorney met me at the county clerk's office in Staunton the following morning. He had driven over from Harrisonburg and was already on the front steps when I arrived, holding 2 cups of coffee from the place on Beverly Street. He handed me one without saying anything. That was the right instinct. We went in and he reviewed the deed, the title history, the mortgage satisfaction, and the photographs of my wife's messages. He made notes in a small spiral notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. When he finished, he looked up and said, "Her attorney is working from an incomplete picture. Either your wife didn't tell him about the joint title, or he didn't ask the right questions. Either way, their letter has no teeth." He paused. We were back outside by 10:50. My phone buzzed twice before we reached the parking lot. My wife. I let it go. My attorney glanced at the screen and said, "Let it go to voicemail. Whatever she says becomes a record." The voicemail, when I listened to it in the car, was fast and pressured. She said she had built that life, that her father's money changed what was possible, that I needed to understand she was serious. Her voice broke slightly near the end, not from sadness, but from the frustration of someone who had expected an easier response to a plan they felt certain about. I saved it, drove home. The house was still when I walked in. I moved through the rooms the way I sometimes did after long trips, not counting objects, but counting time. The kitchen where I had taught my daughter to make biscuits on Saturday mornings. The doorframe in the hallway where I had marked her height every birthday until she left for college. The marks were still there under the paint, faint, but in the right place if you pressed your finger to the wood. I had always known where they were. 41 hours after we sent the letter, the second letter from her attorney arrived. The language was cooler, more careful. It acknowledged the joint title and shifted the argument toward the idea that my wife's inheritance represented a significant change in marital financial standing that warranted a renegotiation of shared assets. I forwarded it to my attorney with a note. "They've adjusted," he replied, "as expected. They're looking for a handhold. We have time. Don't respond directly." That evening, my sister-in-law arrived at the door carrying a casserole dish covered in foil. We had known each other for 28 years. She was a decent woman who had probably not entirely agreed to this errand, and I could see it in the way she stood on the porch, slightly off-center, like someone who had been sent to knock on a door they weren't certain they should be knocking on. I thanked her and brought her inside. We sat at the kitchen table. She told me my wife was overwhelmed by the estate process, that it was more complicated than she had anticipated, that she hoped things wouldn't have to become unpleasant. I listened. I didn't offer anything she hadn't asked for. After a while, she said, she told me the house was really always hers, that you just lived in it together. I looked at her for a moment, then I got up, went to the filing cabinet, and brought the deed back to the table. I set it in front of her. She read it. Her face did something careful and complicated. She said, "She didn't mention this." I said, "People tend to leave out the parts that complicate the story they're trying to tell. I don't hold it against you for coming." She left 20 minutes later. The casserole dish was still on the counter. She had forgotten it in the way people forget things when they've found out something that rearranges what they came in expecting to say. I put the food in the refrigerator. It was a chicken and wild rice dish, the kind that's better the next day. That detail seemed irrelevant and also somehow stayed with me. The following morning, my attorney called instead of texting. That was new. He said, "I need you to look at something. Do you have access to the estate documents, specifically the conditions of distribution?" I told him my wife had forwarded a summary email from the estate attorney 7 weeks earlier before things had turned. I found it and sent it over. He called back in 22 minutes. He said, "There's a clause, and I want you to hear this carefully because it changes the picture considerably." He explained it slowly. My father-in-law, the retired CPA who had kept a legal pad on his desk for 40 years, had inserted a provision into his estate. It was not uncommon for large transfers to include conditions protecting a beneficiary from acting against their own long-term interests. This particular provision stated that the primary beneficiary could not use estate funds to initiate or facilitate the legal displacement of a current spouse from a jointly held primary residence without documented cause and the commencement of formal separation proceedings. Any attempt to do so would trigger a mandatory 60-day hold on remaining estate distributions and a review by the estate executor. I sat down. I said, "He wrote that in." My attorney said, "He did. Which means if your wife uses any inheritance funds to retain attorneys for this specific action, hire movers, or otherwise pursue removing you from the property, she risks putting her remaining distribution on hold. Her estate attorney almost certainly doesn't know she's been doing this." I thought about my father-in-law, the legal pad, the questions before the phone calls, the way he had shaken my hand at our wedding, firmly and directly, long enough that it meant something. He had known who his daughter was. He had built a protection into the language of his own estate. Quietly, because that was the kind of man he was. He had measured twice. He had not said a word about it. I asked, "Does her attorney know yet?" My attorney said he does now. I sent a formal notice 20 minutes ago citing the provision. The response I received was 4 words. "My client is reviewing options." He let that land, which meant they were regrouping. My phone began ringing on the table. My wife's name on the screen. I watched it ring. It went to voicemail. Then rang again. Then a third time, and I picked up. Her voice was different. The prepared quality was gone. What was left was something tightly managed and slightly unsteady, the voice of someone who had just been told the plan they had been confident in had a problem they hadn't known about. She said she thought we should talk, in person, that her attorney had suggested it. I said I'd prefer to meet at my attorney's office, everything documented. She said, "Fine." We met 2 days later. She arrived with her attorney, a man in his late 50s, who had the look of someone who had recently received information he wished he didn't have, and was professionally obligated to work through it anyway. My attorney and I were already seated when they came in. The table between us was wide and clean. My wife looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She had always carried herself with certainty, the kind that came from knowing what she wanted, and she still had that posture, but something in it was doing more work than usual. Her attorney opened with a prepared statement about the evolving nature of marital assets and the substantial shift in financial standing represented by the inheritance. My attorney listened without movement. When the statement concluded, he placed a single document on the table, a copy of the estate provision. The room didn't shift dramatically. No voice was raised. What changed was the quality of the silence, the way a room goes quiet when everyone can see the whole picture at once and there is nothing left to hide behind. Her attorney read the provision twice. I watched him decide which version of the next sentence would cost his client the least. He said, "My client was not fully briefed on the scope of the inheritance conditions." My attorney said, "We understand. That's why we're here instead of in front of the executor." My wife looked at her attorney. He gave her a small nod. Then she looked at me directly for the first time since this had started. I held it without looking away. She said, "I didn't know he put that in there." I couldn't tell if it was explanation or apology, maybe both, maybe neither. I said he was a thorough man. The meeting lasted another 50 minutes. Her attorney and mine worked through the procedural framework together, carefully and without theater. What communications would cease, what the proper timeline looked like, what documentation would be required if she chose to pursue formal separation through the correct channels. Everything moved at the pace of things being done correctly. When it was over, we left separately. She paused near the door to the stairs, her attorney a few steps ahead. She turned and said, "I thought having the money would make everything clearer." Money doesn't make things clearer, it makes them louder. She nodded once slowly. Then she stepped through the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, not because I was undecided about anything. I knew exactly what came next. The paperwork, the ordered process of a separation handled the way it should be. I stood there because the moment deserved to be marked the way I had tried to mark every moment that week, not with triumph, just with time. I looked at my watch, 3:14 in the afternoon. My attorney fell in beside me as we walked toward the parking garage. He didn't say anything. Outside, the September air in the Shenandoah Valley had that particular quality it gets between the ridgelines, cool and clean, the mountains visible on both sides. Traffic moved on Beverly Street. A woman walked a dog in front of the coffee shop, the world doing what it does. My phone buzzed once. My daughter, how did it go? I wrote back, correctly. She sent 3 words back, good, love you. I drove home. I turned into the driveway and sat for a moment before getting out, looking at the house the way you look at something you've been too close to for too long to see clearly. The brick had aged into a color I had come to love without ever deciding to. The porch I had built in 2004, the raised beds along the east wall, the white oak at the back corner of the lot that I had planted from a 12-inch sapling the first spring we were here. The separation proceeded at the pace separations proceed when neither side is trying to accelerate the damage. Her attorney and mine exchanged documents over the following weeks. The estate executor was notified of the provision, reviewed the prior activity, and issued a written reminder of the inheritance conditions. No penalty was assessed, none needed to be. I want to be clear about what happened to the house, because the clarity matters. The separation agreement had to account for it properly. My attorney and I negotiated a buyout of my wife's share at fair market value, assessed by an independent appraiser we both agreed on. I paid her that amount from my retirement accounts. She signed the quitclaim deed on a Thursday morning in February. My attorney notarized it. I shook her attorney's hand at the door. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had figured out, somewhere in the middle of the process, which side of the table was on solid ground. I did not leave the house. The house became mine in the way houses become yours when paper and time and intention all agree. That spring, my daughter drove up from Asheville for a long weekend. We put fresh topsoil in the raised beds and spent a morning repairing a section of the back fence that had shifted over the winter. On the last evening, she sat on the porch steps with a glass of sweet tea, watching the yard go gold in the late light. She said, "You never raised your voice, not once through any of it. How did you do that?" I thought about it for a moment. I said, "Raising my voice would have felt like something for about 30 seconds. Being patient gave me the house." She smiled and leaned her head against my shoulder the way she had when she was small, and we sat there while the yard went quiet and a cardinal worked at the feeder in the back corner. I had not spoken to my wife directly in 5 months. We communicated through attorneys when necessary, which was rarely now. The communications were short and factual. I did not feel bitterness toward her, which surprised me sometimes when I sat with it quietly. What I felt was something more like accurate grief, not the grief of losing something good, but the slower grief of understanding that something you believed in had been, for longer than you knew, more uncertain than it appeared. Her father had seen it. I understood that clearly now. A CPA who had kept a legal pad on his desk for 40 years, who wrote down questions before he made phone calls, had looked at his daughter's nature and then at mine, and had put a provision into his own estate because he knew one day it might be needed. He had not told me. He had not told her. He had done the work quietly and trusted the document to do its job when the time came. I thought about him in the evenings, sitting on the porch I had built in 2004, watching the light change over the Allegheny ridgeline to the west. The man who measured twice and said very little. I hoped wherever he was, he could see that the provision had worked exactly as he intended, that the damage had been contained, that the thing he had planted quietly in the legal language of his will had grown into exactly the protection it was meant to be. The white oak at the back of the lot had put on good growth that spring. It was still young in the way young trees are patient. They don't rush. They just accumulate. I had planted it small enough to carry in 2 hands, and now it threw shade over the corner of the raised beds in the afternoon. I had built this place. Not alone, there is no such thing. But I had been the one who poured the footings on a cold February weekend, who was told the east wall wasn't plumb, who came back the next morning and fixed it. I had been the one still here when the test came. Living inside something and building it are not the same thing. I had always known that. But knowing a thing and having it confirmed are different kinds of knowledge. One you carry. The other you can finally set down. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear what part. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from, what you would have done differently, or what you recognized in it. I read every one. Stories like this happen in quiet houses on ordinary streets all across this country, and the people inside them deserve to know they are not alone. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. Walk carefully out there.